could very well be the biggest mistake of all.
Apple's very poor. We're losing a lot of blood. Suture. Get the rupture. Get the paddles. Get arrested.
Studies estimate that medical errors in Britain are responsible for 40,000 deaths a year. All of them, in theory, preventable.
Every single doctor who's practiced for any time at all has made serious errors, serious mistakes. I think that's a very terrifying thing for doctors.
Last week, we examined how systems are often at the core of medical errors. Improve the overall safety factors in any patient procedure, and whatever human errors may occur can be detected before they inflict injury. Earlier this year, the government accepted the importance of this systems approach to error. But for systems to be improved, doctors must first admit to their errors and openly discuss them so that everyone can learn from them.
It is actually remarkably easy to hide mistakes, even quite serious mistakes. If we can reverse that, then you can start the learning culture.
But admitting to error is still a medical taboo. No doctor wants to break their traditional code of silence. Studies estimate that there are over 300,000 injuries and 40,000 deaths caused by medical errors every year. This film is about acknowledging that medical mistakes will always happen, and the only way to start reducing the problem is by doctors talking about their errors and learning from them.
We get repetition of errors all the time. I think it's down to this cultural secrecy, sort of macho image where we are not encouraged to admit weakness or failure or emotion or vulnerability. And I mean, I think that's across the board in medicine, and medical mistakes are just a particularly sensitive part of that.
The culture of silence in medicine has been many years in the making.
I think there is a whole priesthood around medicine. You're either in the club or outside of the club. There are all sorts of rituals in the way you're trained. All doctors can tell stories of long hours and ghastly experiences, and it binds doctors together. I mean, for a start, you are licensed to invade other people's bodies. If you're a surgeon, you literally go inside people's bodies. You have people's brains in your hands, and I think that is a very strange experience that sets people apart.
The only way to reduce errors is for this medical culture to be turned upside down. This traditionally secret and separate world must open up and admit to its mistakes. Mistakes it knows are happening in every hospital, every day.
I think if you ask every nurse, they've made one mistake, at least one mistake. I think to be infallible in every aspect of nursing care or medical care is just literally impossible. People do make mistakes.
Nurse Sally Brown made a mistake when she was asked by a doctor to give a pain-relieving injection to a patient on the ward.
I was very busily working one day on a coronary care unit, and there was a patient that required some morphine for pain relief. And the doctor gave me this syringe and he said, go and give it to that patient over there. So I trotted off and gave it to the patient. And then he came back to me, this doctor, later and said, well, that patient's still in pain. And I said, well, I thought you told me to give it to that patient. He said, no, it was the patient next door. So I inadvertently had given the drug to the wrong patient.
Nurse Brown was still training at the time, and it had a marked effect on her.
Obviously, my confidence was knocked, and I felt that I wasn't a good nurse. So I think after that moment I realised that as a junior, newly qualified member of staff, I needed to pull my socks out and find out where my limitations were really.
Sally Brown's experience is typical. All doctors and nurses make mistakes. To reduce errors, medics have to learn from their mistakes, which means talking about them. But the culture of silence makes it hard for individuals to be open. One of the first doctors to make a public admission of his own mistake was US doctor David Hilfiker. Although the mistake was a genuine accident, the published story created a major stir, and subsequently Hilfiker left medicine forever. In the late 1970s, he had recently qualified and was a practicing GP in America's Midwest.
I'd been practicing for 4 or 5 years. I was in a small town in very northern tip of Minnesota. We were 110 miles away from any specialist. Next doctors were 55 miles away. It was very, very isolated.
Typical of a country practice, Hilfiker's patients were all known to him. A local couple came to see him, wanting to confirm whether the wife was pregnant. Dr. Hilfiker examined the woman and sent off a urine test. But the test came back negative. He repeated the test 2 weeks later, but again, the tests concluded Barbara wasn't pregnant.
I was beginning to think of the possibility that, which sometimes happens, is that you get a pregnancy very early on, the fetus dies, and there is no miscarriage.
When the 4th urine test proved negative, Dr. Hilfiker was convinced if Barbara ever had been pregnant, the fetus was now dead. He persuaded Barbara to have a D&C, meaning he would scrape out the uterus, which would enable her to miscarry the dead fetus.
She was, of course, very, sad. There were tears because she was sure she was pregnant. And I could have sent her down for an ultrasound. But it was 110 miles away. I knew that they didn't have very much money. At that time, it was an expensive test. They didn't have insurance. I didn't question my diagnosis.
So with everyone now believing the fetus to be dead, Barbara came in for the fairly routine procedure. Dr. Hilfiker started the D&C procedure, which entails scraping tissue from the uterus.
At the beginning, there just wasn't anything that came out. This was starting not to be normal. And so at one point, small arm came out, and I knew that wasn't right. The only thing I could think of then was that the baby had just died, but that didn't make sense either because the tests had been negative all the way along. So I was beginning to be terrified.
Before the operation, Dr. Hilfiker concluded the fetus had died at around 6 weeks old. But yet the arm he had taken out was much bigger and could only belong to an older fetus. But how old? And was it already dead? Or had he just killed it? He stopped the procedure and sent off the tiny arm to pathology for analysis.
When Barb woke up, I went back and talked to them again. And at that point, at least hinted at what I was beginning to suspect, which was that the baby had been alive and that I had done an abortion on a very desired fetus.
David Hilfiker's worst fears were realized when the pathology report came back,
saying that, yes, this had been a body part of an 11-week-old fetus, recently alive. At that point, there was no doubt about what had happened.
Dr. Hilfiker had killed an 11-week-old fetus in a most gruesome way. He found it extremely hard to come to terms with his mistake.
I'd been in practice for 4 or 5 years at that time, so I was still a young physician. And it just made me question my competence as a doctor. Doctors don't do things like this.
This feeling of failure is typical of all doctors and nurses who have made a mistake, no matter how small the error.
If you make a mistake, you definitely feel a failure. You feel a failure to your patients. You feel that you've done something really bad. It may only be a minor mistake, but it was definitely still very much a, you've made a mistake, you've done something bad.
After any traumatic incident, experts agree it is always best to discuss it with someone. But in medicine, when a doctor makes a mistake, there is no one to turn to. No one wants to talk about failure.
No physician that I could find would deal with what I was going through. The obstetrician that I talked to patted me on the back and said, you know, these kinds of things happen, don't worry about it, could have happened to anybody. There was really nobody that I could share this with. And that was personally as devastating as the original event.
I think that not being able to talk about your anxieties and your vulnerability and the mistakes you make can put a terrible pressure on doctors. You don't weep, you don't suffer, you don't feel emotional, you know, it's your job to sort out this problem.
In 1984, David Hilfiker decided he had to find a way of discussing his mistake. So he wrote the story and sent it to publishers. Several magazines ran the article, and for the first time in America, medical errors were being discussed openly. The code of silence had been broken.
There were quite a few letters that came to me from other physicians describing to me mistakes that they had made, having killed some patients, very serious things. And they said how long it had taken them to heal from that.
At last, people were talking openly about medical errors. But a couple of years later, David Hilfiker checked an index of medical literature to see what else had been written on the subject.
And there wasn't a single article that had been published by a physician on the subject of mistakes or errors or any other key word that I could put in there. I was really surprised. What it indicated to me was how taboo a subject this still was. It just sank, like it had never showed up.
The code of silence was far too powerful to be broken down by a few magazine articles. And now there was an even bigger reason not to be open: litigation.
Adverse outcomes are not going to go away. With your television program, with my best efforts, they're not going to go away. We should be able to minimize them, we should be able to decrease them, and above all, we should be able to be open and honest and discuss them. That's a very hard thing to do, where you've got very hungry and sometimes voraciously hungry lawyers looking and going over everything you do with a fine-tooth comb and saying, aha, something bad happened, then you must have done something wrong.
And it's not just an American problem. In Britain, litigation against the NHS is costing the country a fortune. There are currently nearly £3 billion of pending claims from medical negligence. It means doctors are even more defensive about their practice.
Well, there's a very real fear of litigation, and that's fueled today by the ambulance-chasing lawyers who seem to want to bring an action against a doctor if anything seems to have gone wrong at the drop of a hat. That in itself is creating a culture of defensive medicine, which is certainly not in the best interests of the patient or the medical profession.
Another reason for the taboo of silence is the godlike status doctors have assumed over the centuries.
I think doctors, after a while, end up at risk of being deified or put on a pedestal by patients. If you're constantly told by patients that you must be good, or you're excellent, or your white coat shows you how powerful that you are, you become to believe it.
The doctor, in order to cope with life, has to be trained, as we say, to bullshit. It's sad, but it's true, because that's what the public requires of us. That's what we have to do in order to survive. We have to pretend to know things that we don't, because that's the way the system works.
There is still a broad perception amongst the public that doctors are infallible. The reality, of course, is that that is not so, and particularly nowadays as medicine has become much more complicated, complex, it's very difficult for anyone to be a complete expert. It's very difficult for anyone to know everything. It's very difficult, really, for everyone not to make a mistake.
The fear of being thought inadequate, the fear of being sued, the myth of doctors as gods, all mean that discussion of errors is taboo. For that to change means standing the culture of medicine on its head.
Okay, we go.
But in the current culture, medics expect and are expected to be perfect all the time. As a result, they take their errors personally.
When deaths occur, sometimes the medical profession are portrayed as being very uncaring. I'm sorry, that is wrong. I've seen people very distraught, doctors in tears, when these sort of things have happened. When something has gone wrong that they were otherwise completely unexpected. It really, it's an appalling experience that you never get used to.
And unless they talk about and learn from their mistakes, their error becomes a private stain which lives with them for life. Professor James Dryfe is the Vice President of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. 30 years ago, he made a mistake which resulted in the death of a newborn baby. It's an experience he has never forgotten. It's also an experience he has never talked about publicly.
It's the kind of thing that lives in the memory forever, really. You never get rid of that man, nor should you. The feeling of self-blame.
The doctor was called in to a natural birth to interpret the trace on a machine that was monitoring the heart rate of the child and the contractions of the mother. The data suggested the child may be in difficulty. But James Dryfe decided the machine was malfunctioning.
I thought that it was something wrong with the machine and not functioning right. And time passed and the trace didn't really change, but we realized right at the end of the labor that suddenly the baby died.
Professor Dryfe should have reacted to the visible signs of distress and induced the birth earlier.
I can remember the appearance of the trace. I could practically draw it for you now, 30 years later, or best part of 30 years later. But you could remember most of all the feeling that there was someone who had put their trust in you and you'd let them down. You felt absolutely awful. It's the kind of thing that lives in the memory forever, really. You never get rid of that, nor should you. Despite his mistake, James Dryfe learned from it and continued in medicine, rising to the very top of his profession. But David Hilfiker was so affected by his aborting a live fetus and the impossibility of talking to anyone about it that he gave up medicine. If David Hilfiker had continued in medicine, perhaps he would have made more mistakes. But maybe he would have continued to be an otherwise excellent physician. We will never know. If medicine is to lose every doctor who makes a serious mistake, eventually there'll be none left. What is needed is a culture in which medics can talk openly about mistakes, a culture which sees errors as events to be learned from, rather than events which have to be hidden.
It is actually remarkably easy to hide mistakes, even quite serious mistakes. Consequently, if we can reverse that and make people starting to feel comfortable about owning up to their mistakes, then you can start the learning culture. Because by and large, people working in healthcare are extremely well motivated. And well-motivated staff don't make mistakes purposely. In fact, they try very hard not to. And when that mistake does happen, they feel dreadful about it. And they need support.
But there's yet another ingrained obstacle blocking the road to any new learning culture. Medicine has a rigid class structure which doesn't listen to subordinates. Another ingrained reason why errors are so often swept under the carpet.
If people had listened to me earlier on and maybe acted on some of my concerns, then this whole thing wouldn't have taken place. It wouldn't have had to have happened. And some of those children might still be alive.
flown in my time.
I have been indulged like crazy. I've been in more limousines than the president. I've been on planes with bars. I've been in planes with food and drink like you wouldn't imagine. I've been in planes with beds. But I've never done it all at once. Until now. Here's to being spoilt rotten.
Oh, Stuart, if only we had the time, you and I could tell you the many things we could do for you. You've been a bit lazy.
Egg and you, sitting in the tree, K-I-X-S-I-N-G.
A code of silence, the myth of infallibility, and the fear of litigation has meant that medics rarely discuss their mistakes publicly. They also have to deal with an often arrogant hierarchy.
More animation next here on 4 with an evocative look at mortality in 3 Ways to Go.